So tonight's talk is on Carl Gustav Jung, and it's entitled From Collective Unconscious to Individuation. And because this is a philosophy group, we're looking at the concepts mainly. We're clarifying the concepts today. That's what philosophy does. We're not actually conducting any psychological experiments this evening. So we'll start off with Jung and the challenge to the rational self. Much of Western philosophy has presented human beings as rational and capable of knowing their own minds. There is a line of thought that began with Schopenhauer through Nietzsche and Freud that increasingly challenged that picture. Jung develops the idea that important parts of the psyche lie outside of conscious awareness. And as I say, we're approaching Jung philosophically, examining his concepts, their history, and what they imply. So we'll start with this the difference between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. So the personal unconscious is more or less what Freud's ideas were. This may be things we've forgotten, repressed or neglected. The parts of the psyche we are not aware of. This is what it means to be unconscious. The collective unconscious is something social, an inherited structure shared by all human beings, expressed through recurring myths, symbols, dreams, and patterns. Jung's distinctive move is to make the unconscious more than a storehouse of personal memories and repressed desires, and to connect it with human consciousness more widely. An idea you'll often hear with Jung is that of archetypes. And these are recurring underlying patterns within the collective unconscious. Not fixed images, but patterns which take different symbolic forms. Some examples are the hero, the mother, the child, the trickster. And there is a connection here which goes back to Plato, because Plato had a very different philosophy altogether. But Plato he uses this term archie sometimes to talk about the forms. So this word archetypes has some relationship to Plato's forms, at least etymologically. But of course, Jung's archetypes are psychological rather than the true forms that Plato thinks exist objectively. So I want to talk about the persona, shadow, and projection now. The persona is our social face or identity we present to the world, necessary for social life, but not the whole self. And if we identify entirely with the persona, we may not be aware of our wider selves. And some of you may have heard this term of the shadow self. The shadow self may be parts of ourselves which conscious identity excludes or refuses to recognize. It may include aggression, envy, selfishness, and fear, but may also contain neglected creativity, confidence, vitality, or possibility. So the shadow shouldn't be seen as something evil, although often, because it's hidden from us, we often project it negatively. Which brings us on to the idea of projection. We attribute something with our own unconscious psyche to another person or object. We experience it as belonging out there rather than recognizing it in ourselves. Although this idea is often associated with Jung and psychologists, in the history of thought, something very similar was proposed by a chap called Feuerbach, who was a young Hegelian. And Feuerbach's idea was that the human being's notion of God, I think he was talking about the Abrahamic or Christian God, is that so Feuerbach argues that human beings project their own essence onto God. Jung's use is more psychological and individual. Both involve something belonging to the subject being experienced as though it belongs outside of the subject. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about psychological types and the functions of the psyche. Two words that you've probably heard, they come into everyday language as introversion and extroversion. Introversion primarily directed to the inner world, extroversion primarily directed to the external world. And I'll talk about the four functions of the psyche. Sensation, which perceives what is present through the senses. Thinking asks what something means or how it can be understood. Feeling assesses value, not simply emotion. And intuition perceives possibilities, patterns, and connections without conscious step-by-step reasoning. If people go to a Jungian therapist, they are often hoping to achieve what's known as individuation. So individuation is the movement towards greater psychological wholeness. And it's important to notice that wholeness and perfection are not the same. We're not trying to eliminate the shadow, but also we're not allowing the unconscious to take control. So part of what individuation involves is bringing conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche into relationship. So from this perspective, the self is larger than the conscious ego and is seen as representing the whole of the psyche. I now want to apply some of these concepts to philosophy as a whole, or shall we say Western philosophy. In general, Western philosophy treats reason and empiricism as the only ways of gaining knowledge. There are a couple of philosophers who are slightly more enlightened. Aristotle, for example, talks about how to handle our emotions and desires. David Hume famously said that reason is the slave of the passions. However, within Anglo-American philosophy and the analytic tradition, the emphasis is given towards reason and empiricism. And in Jung's terms, this is thinking and sensation. And what is left out are the feeling and intuitive functions. This is actually quite reminiscent of a distinction that Nietzsche made between the Apollonian and Dionysian aspects of culture. The Apollonian is order, clarity, form, and control. The Dionysian, instinct, emotion, embodiment, imagination, the breaking of boundaries. So both Nietzsche and Jung raise the question of what happens when one side of human experience dominates and the other side is suppressed. So I'm going to borrow from Jung's language to suggest that Western philosophy has developed an Apollonian persona centered on reason, analysis, and empirical evidence, whilst feeling, intuition, myth, and other less easily rationalized forms of experience have become part of its shadow. So it's as though philosophy perhaps claims to try and explain human experience, but from a Jungian perspective, it's missing perhaps half of what the human experience is, the parts of feeling and intuition. So my conclusion, therefore, is that we need to kind of do a Jungian corrective on Western philosophy and be critical of those philosophers who take the over-rational or over-empirical line. Thank you.